But what I'd like to talk about today is a little different from the last couple of talks you've had. I came last month was D-Star, I think, or maybe 2 months ago. One on remote control, which I found fascinating, but I have no idea how he was doing it. It's just a whole mystery. So today we're going to go back to those thrilling days of yesteryear. When ham radio first started, well, when I first started in ham radio.
I can't see you, so there you go.
So anyhow, to give you an idea how far back I go, this is this comes from a slide I used to use in presentations for focusing. The old slide projectors, you had to get everything all set up. And one of the things I like to do is to offer $50 to anybody who can build one of those. Looks pretty simple, but it's not quite as easy as it looks. I did see somebody build one on it was on the internet. The only thing is you had to look at it just right because there was cuts in it. And if you got the angle right, you couldn't see that there was a cut in it. But if you can build one of those, bring it in, give you $50 for it. So this is my journey in ham radio. I've been a ham for 70 years now. I'm sort of curious because I look around the room and there's young people here and maybe not so young people. Has anybody been ham more than 70 years? Anybody beat me here? Anybody? Okay, then I am the old timer in the group. So this is just my journey, and I hope you'll find it interesting. I was born in New York City, raised there until I went away to school. And I was a really painfully shy kid. And in 1954, I started in a new school, in high school. Everybody else in the class, it was a class of about 80 at that time. Everybody else in the class had been together since kindergarten. And I was one of 3 kids who came into high school. And I was pretty much totally ignored by everybody else. I mean, they had no use for me. And I was so shy, I couldn't get into anything. So I found a little quiet spot. That's me, by the way. I know it doesn't look like me. I could find a little spot where I could read or, just sort of stay out of the way and not make waves and not do anything else. And at one point, I had picked up a Popular Electronics. This was actually the first issue that they published in October of 1954. And I picked it up off the shelf one day. I really wasn't particularly interested in electronics, but it looked sort of interesting. And I was sitting in that little alcove looking at this. And I remember this is New York City. I mean, I lived on the Upper West Side. I'll show you some pictures later on where I was. And I went all the way up into the Bronx to go to high school. So, a long distance away. So this kid came by and he saw me reading this and he said, "Oh, you interested in electronics?" Well, if he said, "Are you interested in basket weaving?" at that point, I would have been very happy to say yes. I mean, somebody was paying attention to me. So I said, "Sure." And he said, "Well, club upstairs. Would you be interested in looking at it?" I said, "Yeah, of course I would." Take me on up. So he showed me the club. There wasn't much to it. Call was K2LUI. Lewis was the president, and nice guys, and they were all a little geeky like all of us hams are. And it turned out that the guy who talked to me, his name was Fred, lived literally across the street from me on 86th Street between Columbus and Amsterdam in New York. We both took the subway all the way to the end of the line and then walked a half mile to get to school. So every day after school, I would go over to his house across the street. I mean, not any further from here to the end of the parking lot from where I live. And he would work with me on code, a little bit of theory. We'd fire up his B&W 5100, and work Europeans. Now, this is 1954. I don't know if you follow the sunspot cycles, but this was in the midst of the famous cycle 19, the biggest peak we ever had, where you could work. The world was 10 watts in a wet noodle. I mean, it was just fantastic conditions back then. And so with some hard work, I eventually got my novice license, dated. Oops, I guess it's the word. Does that show it all? No. Well, anyway, got it in 1954. Fred, who was the guy who helped me, couldn't give me the novice exam. That was all done by mail back in those days. So his mother had to give me the exam while he watched, and he did the code exam, and his mother took his word for it that I it looked like I passed it, but you sent in papers in, and then you waited. It was another instant getting a license, you had to wait for it to show up. So eventually it came in the mail and I got ready to go. And the first thing I got, while I was waiting for the ticket, was a Heathkit AR2 receiver. It was a nice little receiver, worked well, but one of the interesting things about it is it didn't have a whole lot of band spread. I don't know if you can see from this or not, but this is all of 10 meters here. And this is all of 80. And the way you did the band spread was you tune this thing to the beginning of the band, and then you turn this little knob. And, you change the frequencies in small increments. You had no idea where you were. I mean, whether you're in the band or out of the band. And so it wasn't the most efficient of radios, but it was good. And to top it off, it was cheap. 1954 prices. You willing to go out and spend $25 for a radio? Why not? Okay. And then when I got my ticket, I picked up a Heathkit AT1 transmitter. The AT1 was 35-watt input, crystal controlled, way over there on the left-hand side. Excuse me. And it was a nice little rig. Again, it was one frequency. At that time, the novices were allowed 40 meters, 7150 to 7200. I had a crystal for 7167, right in the middle of the band. And if you can imagine this, you transmitted, you call CQ on 7167, but somebody else might have a crystal for 7180. Well, what do? So you call CQ and then you turn up and down the band as fast as you can in hopes you hear somebody giving you your call. And so that's how it's sort of split operation, but not exactly what we consider split operation today. This also was a very expensive rig. Went for $30. So for $60, you could be on the air. Now, remember, this is a number of years ago, so the dollar was a little bit different than that, though, in those days. This is where I lived. Okay, that little pin is at 151 West 86th, right in the middle of Manhattan. That's Central Park to the right, Hudson River to the left. My antenna, this is a water tower, and this was a corner of a parapet, and there, at the time that I lived there, there was a metal pole that stuck out of it. It had been a flagpole at one time, steel pole. And a friend of mine lived across the street, not the same guy, a different one, strung a wire from the ladder of the water tower over to that pole. And the way he did that was he stood on the parapet and balanced against the pole and reached up and got the wire out. Now, this is before OSHA and all that stuff. And he came down and it was 150 feet down to where our apartment was. Fed was RG58U, no balance, nothing to match it or anything. I think I was probably actually radiating maybe 5 or 10 watts. But back in those days, you could work a lot of stuff with just a little dipole and fairly low power. But after 2 or 3 days, it stopped working. And I went up to see what was wrong with it. And the pole had broken off. It had rusted through, almost had been rusted through. And the tension of the antenna, pulling on it, just pulled it over and it was lying down on the parapet. And I still have to say, I have nightmares about that guy up there leaning on this thing. If it had broken off, he'd have gone out. That's 14, 15 stories down. This is another view of the building. There's a water tower you can see in the corner parapet. The apartment that I was in was this one right here, and around the end is where my bedroom was. That's where the wire came down. Oh. So it's it's not. I mean, it was nice because it was up high, but it wasn't wasn't the highest point around by any means. But still managed to work. And the only thing, it worked well without bothering people for the most part, except that I could not operate 6 meters because in New York City, Channel 2 was CBS. And anytime you went on 6, you just wiped out everybody's TVs, which since there were so many people in the building, just didn't make people happy at all. After a while, novice was only good for 1 year back then. After a while, I studied hard, worked my code speed up to 13 words a minute, went down to the federal building in New York and met the famous Finkelman. None of you, are you from New York? Any take exams in New York at all? Maybe you did. Charles Finkelman was a legend for being a crusty old curmudgeon. And this picture shows him looking serious, but what's missing is his cigar. He always had a cigar hanging from his mouth, and he smelled bad, and the cigar smoke was choking for little kids. And it was really tough. This was the code machine. Used paper tape. Ran through, picked up little dots on the player piano. And you could copy code, and if you passed that, then you had to send, which was a lot easier. And I actually went down and passed the code and flunked the theory. But I was only 15 at that time. But eventually I got my, I graduated to a little better receiver. This was a Halcrafter's SX96. Band spread was now a little bit bigger, as you can see on the right. And it had some bells and whistles. It was still mostly AM and CW. Sideband hadn't been invented yet, so but it was a nice radio. And in fact, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I walked into the Hamfest in Auburn, and on a table right opposite the entrance was an SX96. Oh. And the guy didn't want much for it, so I bought it and had one of the local guys, go through it and recap it and everything else. So I've got it at home, and it's just great. It sounds like it used to. A lot of fun. And I graduated my transmitter up to a Viking Ranger. Notice that the dial is still analog. Okay. How do you know you're near the band dead? Well, you don't know you're right near the band dead, except you could buy a little crystal oscillator from Heathkit that would put markers out every 5 kc or so, and so you could tell when you're getting close to the end. This was 65 watts, 75 watts CW input, not output, and 65 watts on AM. And I made a lot of contacts with that. I used to stay up late at night, like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and work Australians and New Zealanders. But I had to pretend I'd gone to sleep so my parents wouldn't know what I was doing. When you look at these 2 rigs, you realize that's a receiver, not a transceiver, just a receiver. And this was an entirely different manufacturer's transmitter. And if you're using an antenna, how do you get from one to the other? In the early days, they used to use a knife switch, back and forth. Well, they came up with this fancy thing here called a Dow key relay. The antenna would come in. I'm sorry, I have to point. That antenna would come in here. One of these went to the transmitter, the other one to the receiver. There was a little connections here that would trip a relay inside, and it worked fine, except that it buzzed a lot because it would, it was almost like chattering your contacts, and it ran on 110 volts, and it sat behind the rig. So when it chattered, you had to sort of bang it a little bit to make it stop. If you weren't careful and you reached over to bang it, you get the 110 volts. Later on, they came up with ones that were, a little lower in voltage, not so dangerous. But I got a fair number of. Now, what would you do now? I mean, you'd be smart enough to insulate connection, right? I never thought of that at that age. So, this is my my QSL card from back in those days. There are 4 scenes on here that are a little bit unusual. Can you spot any of them? Some of them just sort of dumb.
You got a zone rather than zone 24.
Yeah, it's not 100024. It's New York 24, New York. Okay. Phone, not sideband or AM. It's just phone because there was no sideband when I was doing this. EST. Now everybody does everything in Z time or UTC. And how about the unit for frequency? Everybody uses megahertz now. Those were the old megacycle days. But anyhow, that was what I used back then. Over the years, I've used a bunch of different rigs. This was a Galaxy 5. It was a nice this was a transceiver. Now the switching was done internally from receive to transmit, so no more Dowkey relays for that. But it was still analog, and the outer dial tuned fast, the inner dial tuned slow. You still have no idea where the band edges were because the calibration wasn't perfect. But 300 watts was a big jump up, and I really enjoyed using that rig for a number of years. And then I got an Atlas 210. This is a little hard to tell, but the rig was only about this size. It was really small for the time because it was a tube rig. It was a very small little rig. And it was a great mobile rig. I used it a lot. Until one day I was at, I don't know, Hamfest somewhere. And I was parked next to a guy who had a Kenwood 120S, TS120S. And he was hearing all kinds of stuff I couldn't hear. So what do you do when that happens? You go out and you buy a TS120S. And so I put that in the car. Now, you'll notice this one finally is digital. This was the first digital rig I ever had. And it worked pretty well, but it was mostly for general purpose operating. I hadn't really learned yet about DXing and contesting. So this worked fine for rag tuning and general context and stuff. And then I got a little bit more adventurous and bought an IC 751, which was a little bit fancier rig, and it was also digital, but everything was on the front panel. You know, there were all buttons and knobs and stuff. There were no menus, no computer control or anything. It just was, you know, what you see is what you got with that. And then after that, I went to the rig that I used for many years, which was the Yaesu FT1000 MP, which was a great rig. I really enjoyed it. That had dual receive. Dual VFOs, so you could do diversity receiving, or you could follow, you know, somebody who's operating split, you could listen on one frequency. And it was great until I went deaf in my left ear. And then having two receivers really didn't make any difference anymore. But I used that for a long, long time. And about 20 years ago, I moved up to Falmouth from all the different places I lived around Maine, and got a chance to put up a tower and put up a little bit better station. Now I use a K3 and a Meritron amp. I'll come back to that in a moment. A rotor control. This is, I have a stepper antenna. Do any of you use steppers? No? I'll come back to that too in a minute. Little pan adapter so you can see where, you know, where the signals are. It doesn't tell you the call of those signals, which is a feature you can get on some, especially with bigger displays, but it's nice. And the contest program is there and a printer and stuff, the usual stuff. This is not the way it looks today, because on November 1st, which is when I took this picture, this is the configuration. A couple of days later, I blew up the amp. So I'm now using a vintage amp in its place up there. And guess where I got that in? That's an old Heathkit SB200 amp, built by a master craftsman. It's a fantastically, everything was perfectly placed and lined up. Only somebody who really takes pride in what they do could do something like that. Oh, and he's in the audience too. That was Rick Fickett. Built that. And he sold it to me in what, 1978? Yeah. Well, you didn't know, but I've kept it all these years as a backup. The AL 1200 that I have will put out a full about 1.2 kW. This puts out about 700 watts, but it's been working fine until I try to figure out whether to try and get the amp fixed or get something else. Probably get something else. Although nowadays amps are really, really expensive. This was my setup for a long time up on the hill in Falmouth. The antenna is a TH7, which had 3 elements basically on 10, 15, 20. And then the antenna on top was a 2-element 40-meter beam, which performed very well. The problem is getting to the 40 when it stopped working. It was a really difficult task, because first you had to take down the lower antenna, then bring the other one down, and then bring that down. So eventually I decided I really wanted to get an antenna that had everything on one boom, so it could all be taken care of. So I went and got the stepper, which is what I'm using now. That's the one that's up there. You can see some wire antennas. These are slopers for 80 and 160. The stepper is a sort of an interesting antenna. It's called a stepper because on each of those elements, there's tapes that move in and out of the tubes. They're fiberglass tubes, so that you can control the resonant frequency of the length of the antenna to make it resonant in whatever frequency you want. And it actually is computer programmed to adjust itself every 25 kilocycles. And it really works very nicely when it works, but it's got a lot of moving parts. And there's a reflector for stepper has the information. And if you go to that, you'll find people with all kinds of problems with these. And after I'd had it about 5 years, I had a problem with one of those things that drives the tapes in and out, and we had to bring it down again. It would have been really nice if it had been a tilt-over tower. You know, you could just bring it down, and rather than have to climb up and disconnect the antenna and put it on a sling and, you know, bring it down. But sometimes, you know, you have to do those things. This is a little closer look at it. These are fiberglass tubes here and here. This is the thing, it's called an EHU. I don't even remember what it means. Extended housing unit, something like that. And it's got, the tapes are all wound up in there, and then there's a little motor, it's called a stepper motor, so it does it in increments rather than continuously. And it really, it's huge. I mean, it's up in the air, it doesn't look so big, but down here it does. And over the years, I've operated in a lot of different kinds of activities. I know this club is very active in public events, things, lighthouse things.
Summits.
Yeah, summits on the air, all kinds of different kinds of things. Well, I've done a number of things too. Back when I was still in high school, I used to run phone patches for stations down in Antarctica. Because you know, those days there's no such thing as cell phones or, you know, satellite phones. There were no satellites. Never mind satellites. Satellites didn't go up. Does anybody remember what year Sputnik went up?
58.
58. It was my senior year in high school. So before that, I was, you know, running these phone patches. So that's one of the things that I was involved with. But the thing that I ended up sort of really enjoying about ham radio, besides rag chewing, which I still do a lot of, was operating in other places than just home. This was one of my early forays. This was a camp up in Harrison, Maine. I was a camper there from 52 to 57, and then I was a counselor. When I was a counselor and I had my ticket, the camp director knew that I was a ham and said, "Why don't you bring you know, your stuff up and we'll set up a station for you." So they gave me a little shed with my K2 KMF/1 call because it was up in Maine, and that's me with my Banking Ranger and SX96. That was the main lodge, and this is a view from the lodge. I mean, it's a beautiful spot up in actually South Waterford. And I had a lot of fun operating from there. I got to meet some of the hams in Maine that I eventually got to know in person. So that's one of the places I went. In 1989, do you know Mike Russo, K1JB? Some of you are familiar with him. He used to have some people who were interested in DXing contesting over to his house once in a while. And one time a bunch of us were over there, and he announced he was going to go to Lord Howe Island and operate. Lord Howe Island is about 400 miles off the coast of Australia. And pretty cool. So I went up afterwards and said, you know, would you like to have some company? Yeah, sure, why not? Turns out it was probably a good idea that I went, because when he made the arrangements to go, he was going for a contest, CQ Worldwide Phone Contest. So, you know, it's on a weekend. And of course, Australia is on a different time. So he got everything all mixed up because of the international date line. And he had us arriving in the middle of the contest and going home before it was over. So we sort of got that all straightened out. And this was taken after we finished. We went back to Sydney, Australia, and this is the famous Sydney Opera House. I actually took this picture from a boat, you know, as a tourist going around the harbor. Just to point out, this is where Lord Howe is, off Australia. Some of you may know Norfolk Island, but actually there's a guy who's over there now, who's been operating as fairly, found fairly frequently. So that was a really interesting place, and you can see it's not a very big island. It's about 5 miles long and about half a mile wide at the widest point. And the airport is at the little tan spot, sort of halfway in between. And it's so narrow that they had to build the runway out into the lagoon to make it long enough for planes to land on. And there are three windsocks, one at either end of the runway and one in the middle. And when we were flying in, I was sitting in the right seat in the front. And I looked at the windsocks and no two of them were pointing in the same direction. So, and I was taking pictures and I had my camera up against the windshield and taking pictures. He said, I wouldn't leave your camera right up against the windshield like that. So why not? He said, because you're going to poke your eye out and it's the turbulence we're going to get just before we land. He was right. It's really, really sort of interesting. This was the setup. Oh, I'm sorry. This was the airport at Lord Howe. It's a little tiny building, it's a shack. But they have international and domestic flights. Now, how do you get a domestic flight in a 5 mile long island? Well, domestic for them means Australia. International means New Zealand. That's Dick Hoffman. He was one of the 2 resident hams on the island. Didn't like the contest at all. Had a bunch of buddies around the world that he'd known for years, and he talked to them and didn't want to talk to anybody else. But he was kind enough to sort of host us, and that's my K1EU. This was the setup we had. Those 2 mountains are 4,000 foot above sea level. Wow. A little hard to see that. And we used the old butternut vertical, same one you used on your packet station at Field Day this past year. I've had that antenna we bought for this occasion, 1989. Still have it, and I still use it from time to time. It's a great little antenna. A few years later, I had a chance. My wife at the time was on an exchange to Russia, to Archangel, Russia, so I got to go. And this is the ham was RW3YC. His name was Andy, and he arranged for me to get a license to operate. 1991, which you may remember, was a tough transition time in Russia between real dictators and then Gorbachev and eventually Yeltsin. But I operated, this was Red Square in Moscow. I operated from Archangel for somebody's home. I went to visit them, got to use their station. So that was sort of fun. And Mike and I have gone up to Canada a number of times and operated just over the border up near Grand Falls, New Brunswick. Easy. I mean, once you get up to the top of Maine, it's an easy 5 mile trip across the border. And you can't see it, but we have the PAW trailer we used, which was similar to the one that we even had a tri-bender on the top. Now, this may be tricky. Yeah. Another place that we went to on a trip was Bahamas. You know what? I've tried it. It doesn't. There's no sound and it doesn't work. Oh, try it. So we operated from the Bahamas, and call was C6AVV. We operated on the kitchen counter, and there were 4 of us. Mike and a young fellow named Jesse Cunningham flew down commercially. Steve Freeman, K1JB, and I flew down in a little plane that I had, a little Cessna. So we flew down to Florida and then flew across to the Bahamas. So we set that up, and I think this next picture, yeah, it's just, there's the old butternut again. We use it on this island too. So that was, and this is Jesse. There's Mike and Jesse. Jesse won an essay contest He was in high school. And the YCCC Contest Club had a contest, send in an essay. If you are the winner, you get to go on a DXpedition. He was the winner, and they found out they didn't have any DXpeditions set. So they put out a call, and we answered and said, sure, we'll give him a try. So he was from Maine, as it turns out. We took him down to Bahamas. He was very, very coddled as a child. He had a special macrobiotic diet, which we had to carry in my plane when we went down. And he was homeschooled. And the Bahamas, when we went down there, had just had 2 hurricanes back to back. So there was no infrastructure. Telephones were not reliable. And we told his parents we wanted a power of attorney for medical issues in case something happened. And they didn't want to give it because they didn't want us, they didn't trust us. But we finally, either that or you can't go. So we finally got it. And in the middle of the time we were down there, they called to speak to their son, and Mike answered. And they said, "How's he doing?" He says, "Oh, well, he's learning to swear and spit with the best of us." They were horrified. This is on the Isle of Man. Does anybody know where the Isle of Man is?
Yeah.
Really? That's pretty good. A lot of people know it. For those who don't, it's in the Irish Sea, and it's about equidistant between Scotland, England, and Ireland. And it's entirely a separate country. And this was the home of GD3 UMW, who has a couple of steppers and some other antennas, and let us use his equipment when we stayed in a little B&B while we were there. It was a lot of fun. This is some of the cards for places I've been. That's the card I'm currently using, the upper left. New Brunswick. That was a special call one year, CH9. Boy, did we make a lot of contacts. Everybody thought we were in China or someplace. Yeah. They were really out to get us, so that was fun. VE2CSI is up in Sept-Îles, Quebec, and it's just above the 50th parallel, which puts it in zone 2 for CQ contests, which is pretty rare. There's only Labrador is the only other part that's there. So we got a lot of intention then. There's the Bahamas, the Isle of Man. This was the operation in Archangel. I operated for a short time in Western Australia near Perth, a little south of Perth. This is the Lord Howe Island card. Oh, these are other people. Huh. And the other thing that I've done sometimes, this was a small plane that we had bought about 1994 or so, is for New England QSO parties, would fly to different airports because they were in different counties and operate from there. Just set up the, guess what antenna we're using? A butternut vertical and a little table with, we got commercial power. We would run a long extension cord into the little airport thing. They had parked, this one was up in Belfast, and we were right on essentially the edge of an active taxiway. So they brought the little fire truck over so nobody would run into us by accident. That's Steve operating, I think that one was in Wiscasset. And he's up in Norwich Walk doing the same thing here. So most of my interests in the last probably 20, 25 years have been in the area of DXing and contesting. I've got all the countries except Korea, North Korea, which who knows if that'll happen in my lifetime. And I just enjoy contesting. I don't have the stamina to really put in a major effort like young guys like Rick can do. But I still have a lot of fun with them. The 2 parts I enjoy most are running. I like having stations call. I got used to that when we were on Lord Howe because we had huge pilots, people trying to reach us. And working DX, trying to work stations that everybody else is calling and try and time it just right or get the frequency just right to squeeze through. So that's what I usually do now. And with that, I wish you all a very happy evening and thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Joe.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
May I ask a question of Joe about one of his antennas?
Yeah, sure.
Joe, on the butternut, do you put out radials or just use a common ground right at the base?
We usually use 4 radials. It was a compromise. I mean, it was easy to carry 4 little round wires They were all about 33 feet long, which is quarter wave roughly on 40. And that worked very well from 40 up through 10. It never performed that well for us on 80 with the gradient. And out in the middle of the ocean, it performed on everything very well. Plus the quality is helping. But I mean, it would be nice to put up more, but it's inconvenient if you're going to set it up in a portable location. Just briefly, like for field day, you guys put a lot of radios up. Field day. So we just use 4 radios.
Thank you.
By the way, I did some extensive Google research today, on what $60 in 1954 money is in today's money, and according to some hit I got off of Google, is $703.27.
Still important.
Well, thank you, Joe, for the presentation. And for those who don't know, Joe has supported our field day for over, I'd say, a dozen years, at least over a decade.
As long as he's been doing it.
Yeah, since about 2012. So thank you for doing that. And he's been taking part of the contest, I think, every year, the pizza party, except for one we travel.
Yeah.
You've done that as well, so thank you for that. Always representing Maine very well.